Welcome back to the program. Joining me live in the studio is the former Home Affairs Secretary, Mike Pezzullo. Mike, as we see the Parliament today, it's the House of Reps and the Senate, the condolence motions, passionate tributes, the grief remains for so many, the emotion is high in the tributes to those lives, those innocents lost on December 14. Can I ask you, I read your really interesting piece at the weekend in the Australian newspaper, but with a simple question to start. Should the bill in its form as put by the government pass the Parliament tomorrow? Is it sufficient?
Well, we don't know. I haven't seen, I checked this morning as to whether a bill's actually been released. So they're going to split the bill, two components, a gun component and everything else. It seems that the vilification elements have been dropped. I'll just come back to that very briefly. In terms of what appears to have survived, as I said to the Parliamentary Committee looking at this last week, the prohibited hate group scheme is very good. It's well designed. If you wanted further assurances to safeguard picking up groups that are not terrorist or hate groups but might be in an unintentional way picked up, you could further amend through some, serious engagement between the government and opposition. I would put, for instance, a nexus between the prohibited hate group requirements that have to be met. The Director General of Security has to provide an assessment to the Minister that these groups are promoting violence to the level that could rise to politically motivated violence or communal violence. That's defined in law. You could add a third element, that they are encouraging or glorifying terrorism, for instance. So they themselves are not terrorist groups, but they're encouraging or glorifying terrorism. You could go so far, Kieran, as to add an element that the Minister requires them to disavow terrorism, and if they refuse to do it, they're gone. So that's a reform. I think with a safeguard like that, the measure should be supported. The other thing I would do, to pick up the point that Mr Burke and others have been saying about the inability to deport Australian citizens if they're dual nationals, well, I would go further. I'd amend Section 36C of the Citizenship Act. If you're convicted to be a member of one of these prohibited hate groups, you go on that list of offences that carry citizenship revocation. You lose your citizenship, we punt you. Okay. That's another reform you could do.
So there's some elements you can toughen that up.
I think so, and that probably can't do it by tomorrow night. It requires a little bit of penmanship in terms of the drafting. So possibly over the next few weeks. I think the PHG...
But that's the sort of thing you think the coalition would go in with?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what their thinking is, but I would encourage them to think about a slightly strengthened version of the prohibited hate group scheme is just about there. I think it's a matter of regret, Kieran, that the vilification element's been dropped off. I can understand why, because if the Parliament's not going to support it, but I do think there's a problem in this country. If Jewish groups have to enlist security guards to be protecting schools, because the level of hatred and vilification has gotten to a point where there's a serious apprehension of violence, people are fearing for their safety, something will need to be done in that space.
Well, the coalition in December 18 released its own package and it said, under our package, our message to those who preach hatred, preach radical Islam, glorify terrorism or incite violence is very clear. If you are not an Australian citizen, you'll be deported. If you are, you'll be arrested. Is that a good starting point in terms of an anti-vilification response?
That's the checklist. I think if you go through that checklist, I think the key elements remain. Where I agree with the peak Jewish groups is that you need an additional element, which isn't about being offended or insulted. I think to criminalise that, which was the problem with the bill as presented last week, is a problem. You do start to get into free speech and free exercise of religion problems. But I think if people are vilifying another group to the extent of that group fearing for their safety, in other words, they might be the subject of murderous violence, and I think we do need to go back to a vilification element in the criminal law, but I think that could be left for down the track. Kieran, the bottom line is these laws themselves will not materially prevent another Bondi.
Yeah, you're saying, and we were discussing it off air, you've written in the newspaper as well, that these bills are fine, they might add to the armoury to an extent, but really in your view, the key is that the current legislation, the laws as they stand, need to be enforced more vigorously.
Correct. And the only way to do that is by significantly increasing the resources available for the task, particularly after the Hamas attack in October of 23. And we saw those horrible scenes at the Opera House, people literally driving down to the Opera House letting off flares and protesting and saying, kill the Jews. Now, I'm sorry I have to repeat that, but that we all saw it on our TV screens. You reported it at the time.
I did, yeah.
And then in August of 24, the Director General of Security told the whole nation there is probably going to be, that's the phrase that is connected to the alert level, there's probably going to be a terrorist attack in the next 12 months. Well, he wasn't that far off in terms of August 24 to when the attack occurred. So I'd want to see a significant evidence of a significant increase in the counter-terrorism frontline teams. Were they boosted? Were the joint terrorism teams increased? The National Security Hotline, we haven't heard about that for a very long time. One of the things I mentioned on the weekends, where's the public campaign to increase vigilance so that the public, as we did after 9/11, is engaged in being vigilant, for instance?
February 2025, you wrote a piece, less than 6 months after Mike Burgess's elevation of the threat level. You wrote a piece where you listed the things that need to be done to prevent a terrorist attack on our shores, an anti-Semitic terrorist attack. And unfortunately, tragically, it was a prescient list. Has any of it been done?
In some measures it has. One of the things I called for was the reconstitution of Home Affairs as a centralised portfolio, so the Minister and the leadership of that portfolio have got all the levers. Regrettably and very foolishly, that was broken apart in 2022 after the election, after the first term election of the Albanese government. Mercifully, that's been put back together, so that was done. What I also called for was something modelled on Operation Sovereign Borders, a single joint agency task force with all of these tools on the tool belt of the teams, not just going after them through ASIO's powers and AFP's powers, but do everything. Look at their bank accounts, go after their tax affairs, just do everything. What in the business we would call a full court press. Why is it now that all of a sudden after the attack, the Al Medina Centre, for instance, in Bankstown, is suddenly found to not have had the proper council approval to be a preaching hall? All of those things could have been pulled together using Al Capone type techniques, if you like, to go after everything. Their building approvals, whether they're paying their taxes. You just got to have pressure. This is a pressure game, Kieran, and you've got to have these teams putting pressure on these groups.
And the other thing that you wrote about is the need for Australia, and through the Royal Commission, we hope, to see this as a turning point where that great Australian tradition of leaving your grievances, of not bringing them, your hatreds to Australia if you migrate here, that needs to be returned to. The
Prime Minister calls it the Australian Covenant. I strongly agree with him. The Covenant, and he's described it in these terms, is you leave the hatred, I think he said, at the customs hall when you arrive at the airport. Well, you can't just simply aspire to that. You've got to work at that. So our multicultural programs, for instance, which I think for too long have emphasised diversity, should swing to emphasising unity. Yes, we can have diverse cultures, cuisines, diverse traditions, but it's all within a unified sense of what Australia is, our institutions, the respect for our democracy, the respect for our laws. We've got to move back to a focus on unity, which frankly is superior to and more important than diversity.